of our students, they've been bugging me the entire semester. When are we going to talk about bureaucracy? But you don't have to wait any longer. We're finally talking about it. I know it's everybody's favorite subject, certainly is mine. But yeah, like that song was talking about, like Dr. Rowlett was talking about, often there's a lot of stereotypes about bureaucracy, as well as those who work within the bureaucracy. So first off, I would like to hear from you all, so you can just type or you can unmute yourselves. Just what's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear the word bureaucracy?
Crooked.
Okay,
Sorry.
no, it's fine. Restrictions,
Bureaucrat.
lines, inefficiency.
Police officers.
Police officers, yes, those are street level bureaucrats. We'll talk about those at the end. Red tape, great, Allison. Yeah, that's a common one. Inefficiency. Ugly office colors. Yeah, beige, confusing. Yeah, can be certainly confusing. So yeah, there's all of these negative stereotypes about it. Some of them are well earned. I will definitely say the ugly office colors, that's a part of it. But that's not just part of bureaucracy, but it goes with it. So yeah, we often hear all of these conflicting things about it, or these negative aspects of bureaucracy. But today we're going to go a little bit more into what it actually is. So first, bureaucracy is not elected officials and their staff. So Representative Tom Cole, who represents Norman and some of the surrounding area in Congress, he is not a bureaucrat. He does work for government, but he is not a bureaucrat. I believe attendance is up. So go ahead and mark yourselves here. And then Representative Cole's staff, they are also not a part of bureaucracy, but they still work for government. Same goes for judges and judicial staff. They work for government and they're part of government, but they're not a part of the bureaucracy. What government or what bureaucracy is, it's a way of organization. You can think of it similar to the military, because a lot of what our bureaucracy is based on is the military, how there's a system of hierarchy, standard operating procedures, things like that. So that's a big aspect of what bureaucracy aims to do. Like we were talking about in the comments, it's not always efficient, or it's not always seemingly organized, but that's what it's supposed to be. So what it is in more easier terms, so it's government agencies and the employees who work for those agencies, and they're hired and promoted based on rank, merit, as well as how long you've been there, and they carry out the day-to-day operations of government. Over time, the federal government especially has grown. So we first started out with just a few departments: state, treasury, and war, which that was headed by Jefferson, Hamilton, and Knox. I did look it up after the last one. I was right, it was Knox. He's not as well known. And there's been a few different periods of rapid growth. Government does kind of naturally grow as population grows, as we've kind of seen in the early years. But like I said earlier, there are some specific events that have grown the government as well. So wars, typically you'll see a growth in federal government, because people who are in the military, they are actually part of the bureaucracy. They are bureaucrats, even though we don't naturally see them like that. So World War I, World War II, FDR's New Deal is probably the biggest expansion that we've ever had. We'll probably see a big expansion if the infrastructure plan proposed by President Biden, if that's passed, will probably be an increase as well. Another program is Johnson's Great Society, so the War on Poverty. So it's all of these programs, they would call for new programs, new agencies, things like that. So it requires more employees, more money, things like that. And that's why we see a growth. So how we go about hiring and promoting people has also changed. So government hasn't just grown more or less over the years. We've also changed how we go about hiring people. So we first started out with a patronage system. Sorry, I'm seeing some chats. Okay. The patronage system is basically who you know. So if you're well-connected, your family especially is well-connected, you are politically aligned with people in office at the time, that's usually how you would find a government job. You would say, oh, you know, my cousin's an elected representative and I want to get my son or something job at the post office. You would contact them. So it was about who you know rather than what you know. This isn't necessarily the best way to run a government. It does have some benefits in that usually the president wants to come in to office, or whoever's in power, and they want to have people in government that just agree with them and kind of comply and have sort of the same agenda. So that can be a benefit with a patronage system. We do have aspects of the patronage system alive still today, but we did change it from a completely patronage system. So in 1886, we had the Pendleton Civil Service Act, and this created a system where we would promote or hire based on merit. So you had to be qualified in order to get these jobs in government. And the whole idea was to make government nonpartisan. People really do not like it when government officials, especially today, have partisan or they express political beliefs. So my mother, she works for a federal union, and she's dealt with some cases where people who work for the post office have expressed political beliefs on Facebook, but they also say that they work for the USPS. So they've gotten in quite a bit of trouble. If you're a federal employee, especially, you're not supposed to be sharing political beliefs, especially if you're attaching your job to that. People really don't like it. Or even when I was just an intern for the city of Norman, my boss had to sit me down when I was going into council meetings and say, you might be hearing all these things, but it's your job not to react. You're just there to, take notes or to do a job, nothing else. Because people, like I said, really don't like it when their civil servants express political beliefs. So what the Pendleton Civil Service Act did was create a merit-based system. So we have entrance exams and promotions. They're based off of your qualifications, your technical skills, your expertise. That was a big part of it. Also is about creating professionalization within government. As government has grown from that last graph that we just saw, it's become more complex, especially in today's society. Government aims to fix a lot of the problems in society, and they're quite complex. So it does require some specialized knowledge, which is what Dr. Rowlett was talking about at the beginning. We need specialization within government. This merit-based approach helps with that, that you have to be qualified. So anytime, like if any of you want to become government officials at the federal level, especially, you'll have to take an entrance exam in order to get the job. Sometimes that applies for promotions as well. And there's also like a points-based system. So there's preference for different types. So if you're in the military, often you get veterans preference. Same goes for Peace Corps as well. So if you do want a federal career, you want to go to the Peace Corps as well, that actually will help you out a lot. Like I said, the end goal was to create an administration of experts. So I was talking earlier about how people really don't like civil servants to be partisan. Along these lines, they passed what was known as the Hatch Act. Originally, it prohibited government employees from participating in any political activity at all. They reversed this in 1993 to allow some political participation. So you can't run for office or solicit money for some employees, but you can, be in a political party. This is different though for members of the Secret Service, CIA, or IRS, which they still are not allowed to have any activity. And that's just based on the type of jobs that they do. It's not believed that they should have any partisanship, which those are important agencies, so that makes sense. Some people can get in trouble, like I was telling you the example earlier, with people expressing political beliefs online. As partisan as we are in the nation right now, there are some people that go around and look for this to make sure that federal employees especially aren't participating in politics as beyond the scope that they're supposed to be. So it can be kind of tense for federal employees. So they kind of just abstain from any at this point. So the basics of bureaucracy entails, for the most part, at the federal level especially, comes from the cabinets. So I told you earlier that there's kind of a mix between the patronage and merit system. And the mix is here mostly. So the higher ranking people within bureaucratic agencies, particularly secretaries in the cabinet, in the president's cabinet, those are appointed by the president, and then they're confirmed by the Senate. So that's still the aspect of the patronage system that we still have. It's not just the heads of the cabinets, but it's also some of the other higher ranking officials within executive agencies. But within the federal bureaucratic agencies, they conduct the broad government operations, so the day-to-day operations. So Congress will pass a law signed by the president, part of the executive branch, which houses government bureaucratic agencies. They will actually do the implementation. Sometimes they can have quite a bit of discretion with this. It depends on how specific Congress is when they pass laws. So I had one of my students, when we were doing the immigration bills, they were talking about how some of the language seemed quite vague. And that's for a specific reason. Dr. Rowlett mentioned how bureaucrats are often specialized. So they'll put in vague language. They'll have like goals in mind. So maybe they want to increase public housing by this much. So they'll write that into law, and then they'll send it out to bureaucratic agency. So in this case, it would go to HUD, which is Housing and Urban Development. And HUD would actually make the rules. They would implement it in a way to try to reach that goal. But it gets kind of difficult. And that's where we see a lot of the judicial interaction with bureaucracy, and whether or not the bureaucracy is going too far or not far enough, or what Congress's original intent was, which we'll talk about the judiciary on Wednesday. But when we're talking about cabinets and how who makes up the cabinets, it's quite a significant number of people. So 60% of the federal workforce, they're civilians. It's 77% overall are civilians. In each of the departments, they vary in power, prestige, and size, as well as access to the president. And it depends on the president. So right now, Pete Buttigieg, who's the Secretary of Department of Transportation, probably has a bit more prestige and power and access to the president right now, since the president is trying to pass a massive infrastructure bill. And you've seen Secretary Buttigieg on quite a few television appearances, things like that. So again, it just depends president to president. In each of these departments, they're headed by a secretary, except for the Department of Justice, that's the Attorney General who heads that. So I have a poll for you really quickly. So when we're thinking about how we hire people in our government, what system do you all think is best? Patronage, merit, or our current system, which is a mixture of both? Let me see if Dr. Rowlett, just let me know when that goes live. Okay, it's live, so go ahead, take the poll. I think last time we had pretty close split on two of them. So we just wrapped up talking about some of the federal bureaucracy and how they stem from cabinets, the executive agencies there. They're also something else that's also part of the bureaucracy, that are slightly different. They're known as government corporations. So these are basically businesses that are created by government in order to perform specific functions. These functions or services, they could be provided by the private sector, they might be provided in part, but it's usually not significantly or at all. And that's usually because these types of services are not profitable. So the two main government corporations, especially at the federal level, United States Postal Service and Amtrak. So with USPS, there are other parcel carriers out there like FedEx, UPS, things like that. But they don't deliver letters and they don't deliver everywhere. And actually, the last figure I saw, USPS does about 40% of the groundwork for FedEx and UPS. So it would be hard for these private organizations to exist without these government services also existing simultaneously. Some other forms of government corporations, so Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, those are also government corporations. And the head of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they're appointed by government. And then the rest, I believe, it just operates like a private business, but just the head executives, those are appointed by government. Also, kind of on a more state or local level, housing authorities are also typically government corporations, where the head again is appointed by government, The rest are hired independently. So they're quasi-government, but they operate a bit differently. So when we're thinking about all the different types of bureaucracies and bureaucratic agencies out there, I want to know, so you can just type in the chat, so what kind of bureaucratic agencies or organizations have you all interacted with? Eric mentioned earlier police. Those are certainly bureaucrats.
I've never interacted with them. Slow down there.
So just type in the chat different ones that you've interacted with. DMV, okay. Sometimes those are private organizations, but they're contracted out, so they're somewhat, yeah. USPS, yes. Military, okay. Military, USPS. Department of Defense, oh, that's a fun one to interact with. FBI, okay, I won't ask you why you've been interacting with them, but
No, it is.
EA. Yeah, Department of Tourism is probably for a state or a city, but yeah, that's part of the bureaucracy. Social Security, another fun one to interact with. Okay, well, you can see there's all these different organizations that are bureaucracies that people interact with on a daily basis. And bureaucracy has a significant impact on all of our daily lives. And I think sometimes we don't really realize how intertwined government can be with our lives. So that's kind of why I wanted to go through and see what you all been interacting with, what you've noticed, what you haven't noticed. Department of Land Management, oh. Okay, you guys are a bit different on your poll. You guys were more in favor of the mix than my last class. Okay. So we've been talking about different forms of bureaucracy, what different organizations. But what about the people who work in bureaucracy? We call them bureaucrats. Sometimes that's not a very nice word to use that we use. So we can use bureaucrats, or we can use a nice word, which are civil servants. But it's the same thing, basically. So bureaucrats, they're the most descriptively representative part of our government. And so that means they're most likely to look like us. That means the general population, the makeup there, it's more or less represented in government. Now, there's a caveat with this, and that I'm talking about in terms of overall. It's different when you look at department heads or people higher up within bureaucracy, or if you're looking at localities or states, it differs. But overall, it is the most descriptively representative part of our government. There's quite a few people, again, in the military, about 2,000 or 2 million with 800,000 in reserve. There's 2.6 million who make up the civilian bureaucrats. Only a handful of these people work actually in DC. I think that's kind of a stereotype. Sometimes we just think that all the bureaucrats live in DC. A lot of them do, but for the most part, they actually live in your communities. So they're like Dr. Rowlett and Eric. You know who they are. You interact with them quite often because most of bureaucrats are actually at the local level. In terms of the federal government, the DOD and Veterans Affairs, they make up quite a bit of civilian bureaucrats, actually. It's not just military who works for them. Also, the Postal Service is another big one. Like if you live in the United States, no matter if you're rural or in a city, you actually do have a right to have a post box or some access to the post office. So that's why there's such a large amount of people who work for the Postal Service. And then just a 25% staff all the other cabinets at the federal level, which I think sometimes people are surprised by, that there's not that much staff that goes into all the other 13 cabinets, with DOD and Veterans Affairs making up such a significant portion. So I want to get back kind of to that idea of representation. Usually when we talk about representation, we think of it in our terms of our elected officials. And in this last slide, I was talking about descriptively representing, which is important, which I'm about to get into. But this idea of representative bureaucracy is something that we don't really talk about all that often, because I think bureaucracy is often overlooked. But it's important because we want to have government that looks as demographically diverse as the public does. And it's important for a couple of different reasons. First, it helps people in government understand the issues that many communities are facing. I've heard Dr. Rowlett mention this quite a few times about you can't solve problems that you don't see. And often we task government with addressing some of the most serious issues that we face in our communities. And if we don't have people that come from a diverse amount of communities, or especially come from marginalized communities, we don't really know what issues they're facing at the ground level. We also, kind of getting at the second point, we can't also build relationships to better understand these issues that they're facing. As a lot of marginalized communities, especially, have a long and horrible history of government mistreatment. So just take the Latinx communities. They're in healthcare, and there's been a history of medical tests and experimentation, forced sterilization with people within the Latinx communities. And we see now that there's this lasting legacy of that, in that people who've been here for multiple generations still don't trust healthcare systems, where they won't even call 911 even when they need it. And that's because, again, they just don't trust government. So a way to kind of help address this, and this isn't the only thing that we should be doing, is to try to rebuild trust with different communities. One way is to have a diverse government that represents different communities that we're actually aiming to serve. And that way you can kind of have those inroads and build trust and build relationships so you can make better policies, which is the last point, in making better policy decisions. That if we have people from diverse communities, they can kind of look at different policy and say, oh no, maybe we're missing this aspect, or if we're trying to implement it with this community in mind, maybe we should consider this. So always having people with diverse backgrounds is helpful, in that you kind of can see things from different angles, and it makes policy better and more inclusive and more able to be implemented fully. So I mentioned earlier that we often think about bureaucracy in terms of the federal government, but actually most bureaucrats are at the local level and state level. And they're important for main reason is that it's easier to interact with them. There's more avenues to participation at the local level. And I think people overlook that. I might be a bit biased. Local government's more what I study. But the local government has been expanding. Cities have been growing. A lot of people have been moving to cities, except for recently under the pandemic, people have kind of been fleeing to the suburbs. But still, we've been seeing growth in local and state level governments, while kind of staying flat or maybe shrinking at the federal level, depends on who's in office. And the aspect about local government is important because it gets at this notion of street level bureaucrats, which I believe this term comes from, I want to correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Rowlett, I think it comes from Lipsky. But basically street level bureaucrats, these are the people like police officers, teachers, firemen, city planners, social workers. These are the people that work directly with the public. And they're important because they have different or varying degrees of discretion. And discretion is important because depending on who you are or what job you're carrying out, you can have a large decision-making capacity over someone's life or how they interact with government. So let's just take a police officer. So let's say they pull you over. They have discretion whether or not they can give you a ticket or not, or maybe just a warning. So a couple $100 ticket, maybe it's not a lot to some people. To other people, that's a huge burden. So that discretion can mean a big deal in that instance. So how they're using this discretion is important. Are they using it to help people? Or are they using it to kind of abuse their power? And kind of reining in discretion can be difficult because adding more rules and regulations doesn't always make things better. It can often make it more difficult to interact with government. So why street levels are important is they can act as liaisons between policymakers and citizens. So like I said, they're at the street level, they're interacting with people on a daily basis. They know what's going on in communities. They know the conditions on the ground. Why policymakers are usually more up in the clouds looking down. I think they will often miss out on fine-tuning policy or really understanding the issues that communities are facing if they're not talking to the street level bureaucrats. So like I said, they know what's going on. They know their communities. Well, if they're doing their job correctly, they do. But also, they can help put a face to government. We don't want government just to be this faceless organization that's there to put rules on your life. We want government to be somewhat humanized, that teachers are a part of your community. They're there to educate children, but they're also, organizers in your community. So it helps kind of put a face to government, and who's working in government, what it means to them. And that can also lead into help building trust in programs as well as different organizations, that if you know people in government, you have this relationship, you can kind of start building trust and maybe even start participating more. Because that is something that's also very important, is that we want people to participate more in government. This is a democracy, and democracies are labor intensive, not just in terms of people who work in government directly, but also of its citizens. If people have more trust in government, if they feel seen, if they feel heard by their government, or they feel like government's going to have a reaction, they're more likely to participate. And we want people to participate because it helps with accountability, it helps with policy making, and even you all can participate in government. If you want to get on a oversight committee with the city of Norman, if you live here in Norman, you can do that. I know Eric is quite involved with local politics in Edmond. I mean, it's Edmond, so have fun with that. It's
You
not
want to be
Norman.
on a border commission, folks? Let me know. I'll get you on one.
Yeah,
I'll-
especially younger
I'll
people.
one.
So yeah, if you do feel strongly about government and you want to get involved, I encourage you to do so. Especially younger people. I think it's easier for younger people to get involved because they're usually a demographic of society that's not very involved with government. So I would encourage you to do so. If you have questions about that, I would reach out to Dr. Rowlett, Eric, or myself, or any other your TAs. I'm sure they can help you. Other than that, unless Dr. Rowlett, did I miss anything? Or if there's any questions, I'd love to answer any questions. I know I've missed quite a few things from chat.
So Edward and Cindy were like, why is it got to be younger people? Understand that you guys are younger people, okay? So for example, my friend Alicia Cardula was just appointed to be president of the League of Women Voters for the state of Oklahoma because she's about 30 years younger than their average member and she's 45. So you guys are younger, okay? And
If you're a 70-year-old man, you're young.
Right. No, great job. And so everybody give Daryl, if you have a question, ask a question. But otherwise, let's give him a round of applause.